Hey everybody, my name's Martin Woodward. I'm joining you live from the studio here at San Francisco. Hope you're having a great conference so far. I've actually created a discussion to go alongside this talk, so if you want to drop in there onto the discussions alongside, we can get some comments and see what's happening. So now, people who don't know me, I'm a little bit of a nerd, especially when it comes to data, and I wanted to spend kind of the next few minutes going through the latest state of the Octoverse report. We published that yesterday. It's over on the GitHub blog if you want to check it out. And yeah, so we're going to dig into that, if that's okay. So as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not actually from the Bay Area originally. You might think I was, but I'm apparently not. I'm from the UK. And here's a random picture from my house from the International Space Station. I actually live about here, around about there. There we go, that's where I live there. And I'm actually lucky enough to be able to contribute to GitHub and to the open source community while living in just a random field in the middle of nowhere in kind of rural Northern Ireland. And looking at the image, you can actually see kind of the concentrations of people and all of the street lights and the towns and where everybody are and where they're connecting. And interestingly, we see a similar picture if we look at where open source contribution was done during last year. Here's a heat map of the UK, which I wrote using some Python code. Thankfully, Copilot was there to help me, so I was actually doing that. Apologies to anybody that's playing the Copilot drinking game back home, but I guess if you've got this far, then you're doing okay, so this is great. So anyway, we can see that open source is thriving. This is the heat map of where all the open source contributions came in 2023, and by UK developers. And it's not just where I live in the UK where open source is thriving. If we zoom out to the world, we can see that open source is actually happening everywhere. Over 100 million developers are now on GitHub, and we saw a 26% increase in the global developer accounts across GitHub just in 2023 alone. And in fact, we saw 300 million new open source contributions in 2023. 300 million. So that's a massive amount of activity in just the past year, and it keeps accelerating. So whereabouts are you watching from when you're joining us? If you want to send a picture, a selfie of watching us live, then please do that. Send it along on social media with the hashtag GitHubUniverse, and I'm going to check them all out as soon as we finish this. But if we look back over the past 5 years, the Octoverse report's been going about 10 years. If we check out the past 5 years, we can see that, let me show you how to read this chart actually. So we have up here, we have kind of the country, and if you follow it back, it shows you the position. So then we have, India there in the number 2 slot. It was in the number 3 slot in 2021 and so on. That's how you kind of read that chart. And if we look at the top of the table, we can see that on GitHub, the order of countries has actually stayed static for the first time ever that the Octoverse report has been coming out. And, you know, whoop, that's big news, you know what I mean? Like, why am I making a big deal about this? But what I want to do is actually dig into this, because don't let it, the fact that the top 10 stayed the same this year, don't let that fool you. There's actually massive change happening in the industry. And what I did was I took the current populations of developers that are in the world and their growth between 2022 and 2023, and I just did a very, very rough, linear projection forwards to see what would happen if we took those percentage gains over the past year, project them forwards on the current developer populations to the coming years. So that's what we've got in this graph here, where we can see actually some big changes coming up. In fact, over next year, if we look, a massive change is about to happen. We can see Indonesia and Japan are about to hugely jump up the table if current growth trends continue. And we're going to see they're going to overtake Germany next year, probably, if my math is correct. Let's find out. So, and that's not because there's magically, less developers all of a sudden in Germany. They haven't all gone on vacation to Indonesia or something. In fact, Germany continues to grow. It's actually 22% more developers have come online in Germany in 2023 compared to 2022. What this speaks to is the rate of growth in Indonesia and also Japan, where they're growing well over 30% year over year. And we see a similar situation actually with India. I mean, look at this. If we take the current growth of India, which is growing, into the 40%, close to, if we see that happening and project that forwards, then around about 2027, we're going to see India overtake the United States as the #1 contributor to open source. Some point in 2027 is what I'm predicting in my weatherman vibes, but we'll see what actually happens, because again, this was just Martin math. This wasn't like real math. The popularity of open source with the community and with the rise of developer communities on GitHub, we're actually seeing this like huge sort of democratization of who can be a developer on GitHub, where they can build from. I live in a field in the middle of Northern Ireland, and I can contribute and compete with the best in the world as if I was living here in the Bay Area or in New York or in London. I can do that from wherever I live, and that's what we're seeing happening across the world. In fact, if we drill into, say, Africa and APAC, in Africa, we see that Nigeria is growing a whopping 45%. And they're getting close to 1 million developers in Nigeria now. And it's just a powerhouse when it comes to developers on the African continent. But it's not just Nigeria, actually. Even though it's growing massively and they have a high sort of young, educated population that's growing and wanting to get involved in this global economy. We're also seeing the same happen across Ghana and in Kenya, and actually across lots of countries within Africa. We've seen that huge growth. And frankly, someone who creates a lot of developer education content and helps get that online, we're actually seeing loads of people and loads of interest from those markets, from these high growth markets, wanting to learn, wanting to develop, wanting to get involved in the open source community. Now over in APAC, the wonderful city-state of Singapore, it's got to be my favorite place in the world. Still need to get out there, so I'm looking forward to making it out there, because it actually has the highest concentration of GitHub accounts per capita in the world. And it's growing. It's growing at 40% year over year. And so I definitely need to visit, because I figure I'm going to see so many GitHub stickers around in the laptops in coffee shops and things like that. But then look at India. India has now broke 13 million developers, growing year over year. I think it's 36% is the exact number. It's close to 40. And that incredible growth is what's driving it and why it will probably overtake the United States in open source contribution by about 2027. And then we see also we've got these larger developer populations such as Vietnam, such as Indonesia. There's 2.9 million people currently in Indonesia, and that's growing 30% year over year. And so that's why you're seeing them grow so much within the charts. And it's clear that a lot of new people are coming into open source, which, as somebody who's been around a very, very long time, seeing new people come in with fresh ideas just makes me excited to be part of the community every day. The number of first-time contributors who joined GitHub platform in 2023 is higher at any point in the past year than it has been in the history of humankind. There are more people getting involved in open source now than have ever been involved before. Open source is clearly the foundation of modern software development. If we want to dig in, people talk about open source winning. It's clearly won, but it's not just winning as in it's the way everybody builds software now. So let's dig in a bit more, and we'll look at what projects people are actually contributing to. You've seen some of these projects, being talked about in the awards and being discussed. We can see the big players. Everybody knows VS Code's popular. That's awesome. But then there's some surprising ones. I always get surprised that Microsoft's Power Toys and Microsoft's Azure documentation is in some of the top open source projects in the world in terms of contribution. Docs, really? But that just, again, shows you it's who can be an open source contributor, who can take part in an open source project. You don't have to code. You can be contributing to documentation, and you're still improving, the good for everybody. You're still making the world a better place. Also, one of my favorite projects, something I'm slightly addicted to, is Home Assistant, and it continues to shine as one of the top projects in terms of attracting new contributors to open source. If you haven't played with Home Assistant, sorry, it's a thing you install on kind of a Raspberry Pi or a device, and it helps you with your home automation and helps you bring things together from, say, different, home automation vendors and make them all work as one. And you just start with like hooking up a couple of light bulbs, and before you know it, you have your curtains automated. I have my washing machine sending me a text message when I've accidentally left the washing in too long, or when my family have left the washing machine in too long, which, by the way, son, if you're watching, you need to press the washing machine button again and press play for me, because those clothes are going to be really smelly when I get home. Anyway, what else was I saying? Sorry, Home Assistant, awesome. Google have been doing the Flutter project, and it's actually doing incredibly well with developers if we look here. Flutter, if you haven't played with it, it's a project which helps you kind of build really beautiful apps for mobile and beyond. It's a great project to take a look at, and clearly lots of people are. But tell you what really surprised me about this chart, and it kind of made me have a aha moment, there's a lot of hype around AI, we all know it, But when I was actually looking at some of these numbers, I'm quite used to seeing VS Code up there, quite used to seeing Home Assistant. I think they've been in the top 10 forever, basically, for a long, long time. They're bringing new people into their communities. But what's remarkable about 2023 is so many of these projects around generative AI. And they're not just entering in open source, but they're actually bubbling up to the top of the open source kind of world in terms of attracting new people. And that's an incredibly short time. We weren't really talking, we were just about talking about Gen AI this time last year, and now they're already up there. And I've never, ever seen such a massive change in all of the time I've been looking at these reports. So 2023 is clearly the year that AI's, gone mainstream. We saw massive numbers of developers experimenting with generative AI projects. These are the fastest growing open source projects by the number of contributors that they have. While it makes me feel like when I started my career was just as the internet was kind of kicking off, One of the first things I did was convert a site from Gopher to a website with this Mozilla browser, this crazy new thing. So that was clearly an epoch. Yes, there was a lot of hype. There was petstore.com. There was all of these crazy things and the dot-com bubble and all that stuff. But the internet has completely changed how we do everything, from how we talk to our families, how we navigate, how we do business. I haven't had this feeling about being at an epoch, about being at a turning point, and up until the internet came along. That's how it feels, and the data's really showing we're at this changing point now. Developers, they're experimenting with AI, they're playing with large, foundation models, they're having, investigating them. But these large language models, they still require significant investments to run, to train, and we're seeing lots of developers investing tons of time into learning them, learning frameworks, learning how to play with them. We're also seeing a huge innovation actually happen within the open around some of these models. As we all know, a lot of these models are not truly open source, but in the areas of performance and in the areas of rapid innovation, we're actually seeing that start to happen in the open. And, it's been around a long time, the Octoverse report. I've seen a lot of these trends come and go, but that's really, this next graph is one that really, really, really kind of stood out to me and kind of it left me in shock, if I'm honest, when I first saw it. I needed to check the math. If we do keyword analysis and we identify which projects are related to generative AI, we can see a massive spike in experimentation around new open source creation related to Gen AI. This isn't like anything I've ever seen. This is just crazy. Look at that graph. And while open source is kind of democratizing, who gets access to be a developer, actually, quite interestingly, if I look at the top 10 economies doing generative AI, we get a very different story. And this is actually where we see the US significantly ahead of other communities. India, coming strong, they're next on the list. And then we kind of got Japan, Hong Kong, the UK, they're all coming up, but they're a long way behind the leaders in terms of the number of people getting involved in these communities. The difference between this and, say, the top 10 list, that's pretty stark. It's very interesting to me. Now, obviously, we don't know why. We don't have the data as to why this is, but we can see that it is the case. Personally, I would speculate around generative AI still requires quite high compute capacity costs, which then maybe is creating a bit of a wealth gap. But we see that open source brings more innovation and brings it out to everybody. I'm really hoping that over the next year, we're going to see the open source community, and frankly, we're going to see, free market competition helping as we go forwards to bring down a lot of those costs associated. And we're going to bring down the compute costs. We're going to have more and more open innovation and hopefully help to bring Gen AI into the reach of more and more developers as we go. So now you're all hopefully by now at least heard of one of the most famous generative AI products out there, Copilot, and hopefully you're using it. But what are the languages, what programming languages are people actually using to code in, and what's Copilot helping them code with? There you go. That was a segue almost worthy of Damien, that was. So there's plenty of JavaScript still, is basically what I want to tell you. In fact, this year, we're seeing TypeScript sort of catch up and now is overtaking Java in terms of the new developers that commit. So I'm just going to show you this graph again. You can see JavaScript comes along, the line goes back. We see we've got Python there, which is doing amazingly well. And then TypeScript has just now overtaken Java in terms of the number of people, the number of contributions that were made in the last year. But look at this. This is super weird. What's going on here? We see C and C++ are actually growing and outpacing languages like PHP, for example. And there's still plenty of PHP development going on. It's not, there's loads of PHP development. So I think it's maybe a little bit too early to come away with conclusions about what's happening there. I've got some, which we'll touch on in a sec. But it's definitely a trend to watch and see if that's a temporary blip or if that sort of trend continues to happen next year. If we dig in and we look at the top languages in 2023 by usage, so this is the number of times that these languages are used within commits. If we look further down the charts of what we just saw, we can actually see that in 2023, the cloud-native languages start to come in. We see Go increasing massively in popularity, and lots and lots of HCL scripts, can't get away from them. So clearly, people are committing more and more, and they're building on infrastructure as code. Infrastructure code is no longer just a niche thing that people at DevOps talks are interested in and things. It's become very much a mainstream technology that lots of people are using and then are baking into their products and their projects. And while this is looking at the total amount of code that we added in 2023, if we look at the percentage growth of different languages, that's where we see the kind of languages that aren't growing, that aren't high in terms of total developer population, but they're growing quickly. So let's look at that graph now. And obviously, we see Rust at the top of the table. That won't surprise many people here. I mean, let's face it, if we know a Rust developer in our lives, they've probably told us they're a Rust developer. But in terms of growth, their community is actually growing the most of every language on GitHub right now. So, hey, they're not going to shut up talking about it, sorry. But if this trend continues, I'm pretty sure we'll be seeing Rust very, very soon entering those top charts. And, while Rust's great, again, lots of attention, is great for sort of moving from some of these languages that maybe you would code in C++ and do it in Rust for a bit more safety. What's surprising to me was actually seeing Lua at the top of this table in terms of growth. Now, it's a smaller community, granted, but it's quite a bit smaller. But if I combine kind of the growth in Lua with some of the growth in things like C and C++, I don't know why, but it feels like there's a lot of embedded development that's happening and a lot of growth in the embedded community, and that's possibly what we're seeing represented in this data. So again, trends to watch as we go forwards into future years. But if we look at this is what should be interesting for the Python community. If we look at TypeScript, and actually some of the more skeptical people within the JavaScript community, to be honest, if we look at TypeScript, it is now the third most fastest growing language on GitHub, and it's also the third most popular language on GitHub. If we look down the chart here, where's Java? It's way outpacing Java. So Java's clearly not going to overtake TypeScript. but also as we look up, maybe it's going to make a dent. Python's growing pretty fast. We'll see. It's going to be interesting to tell, what happens over the future years. I actually was involved in the early days when it came to open sourcing TypeScript. That's one of the things that I helped out with back in the day. And I remember having this conversation with this guy called Anders Halsberg and somebody called Amanda Silver when they were actually open sourcing TypeScript. And I remember just sitting there in the meeting going, yeah, right, you're gonna do this new JavaScripty thing, it's great for the Office team at Microsoft, but who's going to really care about this? The JavaScript community, they're never going to adopt it. So it shows you what I know. So that's the wisdom you tuned into, folks. But there we are, hey-ho. And then we see HCL actually is growing massively, so we continue to see loads of growth there. Now, if we look, another thing around sort of cloud native is actually around the number of Dockerfiles. So pull this quick chart to look at the number of public repos that have a Dockerfile. It's still growing healthily, but we are noticing a little flattening of that curve. So we're seeing plenty of containers being built in the open, but it's not growing the same pace this year as it was growing in previous years. Now, you've seen other points in the chart, actually, where the chart kind of flattens out and things. So it's going to be interesting next year if that's just kind of like a temporary thing that it's evened off like that and we'll see a big boost, or if actually, if we're flattening out that curve. We'll find out. But whatever it is, it's clear that developers are investing lots and lots of time within cloud-native technology, within containers. So I'm going to, start to come to the end, start to wrap up around some of the data on this year's Octoverse report. But remember, the data that we're looking at comes from public contributions to GitHub. I often have conversations and I'm talking to people and I'll talk about, say, GitHub Actions or, some of the changes we see in languages around the ecosystem and things. And they're always kind of going, oh, yeah, that's great. But that's public data, like, what's really happening in the world sort of thing. So one of the things I want to do is just quickly show you this statistic. What we see is the public activity on GitHub only accounts for 20% of all of the activity that's actually happening on GitHub. Most of the activity within the GitHub platform is happening within private projects. So it's a really busy place. If you saw some of the keynotes from yesterday and the day before, and today, this morning, you'll notice a lot of efforts being taken into the needs of kind of enterprise organizations and, organizations that are wanting to build on GitHub, but build in a way that was pioneered by the open source community. So that doesn't mean that all this development that we've got, it doesn't mean that it's kind of happening in the open, but it is happening in private. Now, for people that don't know, actually, you can, for quite a few years now, actually, GitHub, you don't have to have your project for, public on GitHub for it to be free. We made it free for everybody now on GitHub, so you can have private projects, you can collaborate, and we've clearly seen lots of growth within private projects on GitHub. But does that mean, we've got lots of people working in isolation? Absolutely not. When we survey the developers across GitHub, nearly half of developers, they say their community within their company is fully adopting, or is it active culture of inner source. So 56% have a very active inner source culture within their company. What do I mean by inner source, first of all? How do you define inner source? Well, inner source is using practices that we learn from working in the open source community and applying them inside the organization. So that's trying to break down the silos within inside your organization, break down like, oh no, you can't access this code, this is only for me, but moving to a culture where we're sharing by default and we're helping everybody learn from the best within the company, and we're just learning together because we're trying to figure out all this stuff that we're being asked to build. What's amazing to me, and I've been involved both with the open source community, but also the inner source community and things like inner source commons. I've been involved with them for a very, very long time. And what was incredibly pleasing from our latest survey, now this is of developers who are using GitHub, remember, but nearly all of them say their company are adopting some inner source practices. So that's kind of like, a puddle telling you that this hole fits great that they're in, you know what I mean? Because people who are on GitHub are obviously going to be doing inner source more because it's a great platform for sharing. But I can do the inverse of that as well. if you want to encourage sharing within your organization, if you want to try and break down those silos and build a culture of inner source, then clearly people who are using GitHub are having significant success in that. So definitely take a look and see what you think. I'm just thrilled that people are coming together really on GitHub to build cool things together, whether that's in private, but hopefully in the open. One of the things you can take away from my talk is don't be afraid to learn in the open. That's what we're seeing with Gen AI, is a whole new generation of engineers learning in the open. And it's by learning in the open together, by sharing what we learn, by coming up with cool techniques and patterns and then sharing them. What do you think is cool? Doing that is the power of open source and is what's going to help you succeed in your career as you go forwards as well, by being open to the thoughts of others. Believe it or not, the smartest person in the room probably isn't sat, well, the smartest person in the world probably isn't sat in the room you're in right now. You're probably the smartest person in the room, obviously. I know I am. But the smartest person in the world probably isn't sat with you right now. So be out there, be listening, be learning from others, and always stay curious. Adopt we call it like a growth mindset, but try and adopt a culture of learning to yourself. Right, I want to finish up with my main takeaways. So it's clear that open source is stronger than ever, right? We've got more people contributing to open source and more new projects contributing, more new people and more projects around in the open source community. We've got more people than any point at any time in our history. Those people, they're all coming from lots of different locations. So they're bringing their ideas, they're bringing their problems, and they're bringing them and solving them within the open source community. In fact, we're at a crucial turning point where the balance of power within the open source community is rapidly changing and it's decentralizing to be truly globally spread. We appear to be this big cusp in a change in kind of the top open source economies, where they are in the world, and therefore that's going to influence actually the kind of projects that people build and how they solve solutions, which I'm just thrilled to see. The healthiest ecosystems in nature are the most diverse. And so by seeing this change within the global community, again, shows to me that the health of the open source community is very, very strong. Finally, we're seeing generative AI drive massive growth in open source. We're seeing more and more projects related to generative AI, but I'll give you one fun fact before I leave you, actually. Almost a third of open source projects with at least 1 star, almost a third of them have at least one maintainer who's using GitHub Copilot. And so for the people watching back home, but also I know some of the Copilot team are watching back home, they're helping actually not just learn from open source and not just build and work with open source. They're helping engineers and maintainers who are creating new open source do that more effectively, do that more securely, and be more productive. I personally, I'm like a pretend programmer. I play an expert on TV occasionally, but I'm able to take open source and pick projects up that normally I would put off because I know enough about programming to know how hard something is. With Copilot, I'm actually able to take it and actually get started and go work on that project. And that means I do crazy things in the weekend that I probably should be, instead of talking to my family or whatever. So I'm really just pleased to see that we're actually making a difference there, and that open source maintainers are also able to be supported by free access to GitHub Copilot. Right, so if you haven't checked out the report, do check out this year's Octoverse report and see what your conclusions are. Don't forget to share them within the discussions. And just thank you very much for your time.